Alright guys, how's it going? Prophecy, by its very nature, is often hit and miss. So when I make a video on what I feel is likely to happen in 2020, I'm under no illusion that I can't be entirely wrong. What I can do though is analyse the current and past situations in order to form what I believe will be the most likely conclusion. And I'll start by recapping the current situation. So AMD and Intel are essentially fighting 4 different CPU battles. First and most important from the financial perspective is the battle for the data center where Intel's Xeon fights AMD's EPYC. The second battle is on the high-end desktop where Intel's Core X series and W series workstation CPUs fight AMD's Threadripper series. The third battle is on the desktop, both consumer and business, where Intel's Core and Pentium series fight AMD's Ryzen and Athlon series. And the fourth battle is in laptops, where, again, it's Core and Pentium versus Ryzen and Athlon. Now let's talk about size. There are people out there who believe Intel and AMD are on a reasonably similar level regarding stuff like structure and finances. A quick look over the important facts and figures, though, quickly dispels that notion. Intel employs around 110,000 people. AMD employs around 10,000. Intel's 2018 revenue was around $71 billion, where AMD's was only around $6.5 billion. Intel's 2018 net income was $21 billion. AMD's was $337 million. And Intel has around $128 billion in total assets, whereas AMD's is only around $4.5 billion. Intel has 11 times more employees and 11 times more revenue, which is obviously a huge difference. However, for me, the real difference here, it's the cash basically. Intel made 62 times more profit than AMD last year, and they've been doing similar to that every year for decades. And that's a major reason why they have 28 times the value in assets. To sum that one up simply, Intel are a far bigger company than AMD. So much larger that the latter really shouldn't have any chance of competing. So why then are AMD competing better than ever before? One major reason for it is focus. Intel has 11 times the manpower, however, they also have a huge number of products outside of x86 CPUs, from FPGAs to networking and memory, among many others. Before Lisa Su took over at AMD, AMD were very unfocused. They were dabbling in some ARM stuff, phones and tablets, and they also had graphics of course, but at some point around 2013, they were getting perilously close to bankruptcy. The products were simply not good at all, and after Papermaster and Su came in, they cancelled a bunch of projects and refocused the company on high-performance compute. The graphics division undoubtedly did suffer as a result. However, graphics and AI are just too important to ditch altogether. Neglect is the word I would use for their GPU division. But essentially though, Intel are huge, but spread pretty thin if you look at their huge product portfolio. AMD were small and spread too thinly. However, now they are small and focused. Obviously, there's no question that Intel's entire x86 design and production capacity still dwarfs AMD's. However, it's not as crushing as some of the numbers might have you believe at first glance. What is overwhelming though is Intel's ability to spend their way out of trouble. I don't want to get too political in this one, and by now I'm quite sure you must be sick of seeing this financial horsepower slide, but this is just a fact of the CPU environment. This $3 billion spend your way out of trouble budget for 2019 is nearly 10 times AMD's 2018 profit. And if Intel needs to spend more, then they certainly could, as $3 billion is only 1/7 of their entire 2018 profit. Let's get back to those 4 battles in the servers, high-end desktops, consumer/business desktop, and laptops. Right now, AMD has the largest lead in server CPU that they've ever had. Core counts rule in the data center, and realistically, they have 64 cores versus Intel's 28 cores. They are basically twice as fast These 56-core 9200s that Intel has, they don't really exist in any kind of volume. AMD's prices are also lower. Slam dunk, you say? While it should be, it's a far cry from that. In fact, Intel still had 93% of data center sales last quarter. In that quarter, their data center group saw record revenue with a mix of high-performance Xeon processors and growth in every sub-segment. Now, AMD's data center sales are increasing too, but again, it's very much of a case of that 11-to-1 difference in company size also being seen in sales. This server stuff moves quite slowly though. However, I feel that given AMD's crushing performance advantage, they should be doing a lot better than what they are. In the high-end desktop segment, AMD just launched their 32 and 24-core Threadripper 3000 series, while Intel launched their maximum 18-core Cascade Lake X series. I'm sure you've seen the resulting benchmarks and you probably heard about the fallout between Intel and many in the tech press over how Intel tried to manipulate the launch so that those comparisons weren't made. That ploy failed somewhat, as the tech press today are much wiser to these moves. Regarding market share though, we don't have any numbers on this. However, AMD's Robert Hallock did say during a call that at certain points during previous Threadripper product launches, some of those chips were number one on sales in the high-end desktop space, obviously. At a guess, I would say AMD probably has around 20% of the high-end desktop market currently, though the market itself is only worth around $1.5 billion per year. In consumer desktop, Intel still has over 80% share. The last numbers I had was 82% versus 18% for AMD. If you're wondering how that can be the case when we are constantly being bombarded with Mindfactory and Amazon numbers showing Ryzen 3000 eating Coffee Lake for lunch, these market share numbers of 82 and 18% do include the entire spectrum, from the lowest end Pentiums up to chips like the 9900KS. Intel also does very well in business PCs and with the OEMs, while AMD tends to do a bit better with the much smaller market of self-builders and power users. AMD is gaining share steadily, but again slowly, and the consumer desktop arena isn't quite as cut and dried as server and high-end desktop is. The fact here is, gaming is important, and Intel still holds that small lead at the very top. And everywhere else is a close-run thing, with the Ryzen 5s and the i5s competing pretty closely. However, AMD's chips are actually a bit more expensive if you only care about gaming. Now, even with that though, I personally find Intel CPUs very difficult to recommend, mostly due to all of the security issues. We saw in the last video that they basically recommend disabling hyperthreading on all of their CPUs previous to the 9th generation. I personally had an i7 6700K, which I would not be particularly happy about turning into an i5. Who knows what vulnerability will strike Intel next. And finally, in the fourth battle of laptops, Intel has around 85% share, I believe, though AMD has been gaining steadily, quarter after quarter for the past 2 years actually, but that has come from a very low base. That low base was caused by Bulldozer being extremely inefficient and the last thing that you would want in a laptop. But if you put all of that together, Intel's CPU share is between 93% and 80% depending on the segment. Again, that is a crushing advantage in market share for Intel. However, AMD is gaining in every segment. Now, for this next part, I'm going to talk about manufacturing. One major reason for Intel's previous success was their manufacturing prowess, both in technological superiority and in capacity. Going back to around the 2004-2005 timeframe, after a mediocre 90nm node, they went on an incredible roll, starting with 65nm, and that was helped massively by their new Core architecture. Core was shrunk to 45nm, then followed by Nehalem on the same process, which was yet another great leap forward for Intel. AMD's 65nm was poor though, as was their Phenom architecture. However, most of the problems were fixed at 45nm with Phenom 2, which only lagged Nehalem by a month. Intel followed up on Nehalem and 45nm with a strong 32nm die shrink called Westmere. They then followed up on the same 32nm with the incredible Sandy Bridge architecture. Back then, Intel were still in the real Moore's Law of a new node every 2 years, or very close to it. But at 32nm, things started to go badly wrong for AMD. The first proper APU, Llano, launched with very poor clocks of only 3 GHz, and yields were extremely poor. That was then followed by their disastrous Bulldozer architecture, which was large, power-hungry, and slow. Intel, on the other hand, had realised that time was running out for clock speeds on the old processes, and they had opted to use FinFETs at 22nm. What's telling here though is that even with the FinFETs, they were only able to match the Sandy Bridge 2700K's clock speeds of 3.5 GHz base and 3.9 GHz turbo with the new Ivy Bridge 3770K. Haswell followed the year later on the same process and with the exact same clocks, though Intel did ramp it up sometime later with a 4 GHz base, 4.4 GHz boost, 4790K. AMD though toiled with their awful architecture, which was scaled down to 28nm, what is known as a half node in the industry. In other words, it was marginally better than GlobalFoundries' poor 32nm process, but it honestly didn't matter much as no process could possibly have saved Bulldozer. So this was 2012-2013, and at this point in time, Intel appeared to have an almost unassailable lead. None of the foundries, be that TSMC, GlobalFoundries, SMIC or UMC, had planned for FinFETs on their own 20nm nodes, which led to that node being barely better than their previous 28nm. Nvidia infamously had a real go at their partner TSMC during this period, slamming their 20nm as being worthless. Next up for Intel was 14nm and their Broadwell architecture. There were murmurs of a problem but nothing concrete until they finally launched the oddly named i7-5775C. Clocks were poor, only 3.3 GHz base and 3.7 GHz turbo, and the TDP was only 65 watts, well down on the usual circa 80 watts plus of previous flagships. The chip also included a large 128 megabytes of L4 cache, called Crystalwell, which did help it a fair bit in gaming. But during the AnandTech review, we were treated to this slide and an admission, of sorts, that 14nm hadn't been smooth. The forecast though was that this would improve to be in line with 22nm, but we discovered much later on that that wasn't how it went. If you note, Q1 of 2014 is where it starts. What Intel didn't show in this slide was the disaster that they had had just before then. However, this slide, which noted that they believed they were on track for matching 22nm yield by the first quarter of 2014, clearly did not happen. Another year and another claim of 14nm yield trending to match 22nm, but by this point, nobody was buying it. For the first time in history, Intel's manufacturing division looked vulnerable. They followed up on their 14nm with 14nm plus, later admitting that their old tick-tock model was finished, replaced instead by process architecture optimization. TSMC and GlobalFoundries, meanwhile, had delivered FinFETs at their 16 and 14nm nodes. Both of them had arrived at FinFETs in the same way, by using a hybrid approach of 20nm and 14nm. But this meant that these foundries' 14nm were not truly on par with Intel's 14nm, which was now on its way to becoming 14nm plus, or process architecture optimization. So it was no real surprise that in late 2016, rumours of even more problems on their next node, 10nm, began gathering steam. And it was crystal clear that Intel were having real trouble maintaining Moore's Law. Since early 2017, the headlines have been dominated by Intel's inability to deliver a working 10nm process. Meanwhile, TSMC goes from strength to strength. Their 7nm is a true 7nm and is clearly better than Intel's 14nm and any amount of pluses. Zen 2 has overwhelmingly superior performance per watt. What's more, TSMC's 7nm Plus, using extreme ultraviolet lithography, is coming very soon, while Intel looks forward to their own 7nm at some point in the distant future. 2022, looking most likely today. And that's a history of how we got to this point in very late 2019. In a nutshell, Intel's inability to get a working 10nm process has meant they've lost the manufacturing lead that they held for decades, and now AMD has an enormous lead in performance per watt. But what about 2020 and beyond? Intel are huge, too big to fail, and it's only a matter of time before they're back in the lead, both in process and architecture, right? Possibly, but certainly not in 2020. When Threadripper 3000 series launched at the end of November with 24 and 32 cores, AMD also stated that a 64-core version was coming in 2020. I believe that they will launch it in a few weeks at CES. And simply put, this is 64 cores versus 18 for Intel next year in the high-end desktop space. Intel does have a 28-core workstation CPU, however, that is based on their very best silicon die that they use for Xeon. Furthermore, it gets soundly beaten by the 32-core Threadripper anyway. The only thing saving Intel in the high-end desktop is AMD's pricing. 64 cores versus 18 cores or 28 cores, it just doesn't matter. That's an impossible task for Intel to even get close to next year. And there's really nothing else to say about it. Moving up a tier to servers, and for the first half of the year, the situation is really the same because the server chips and high-end desktop chips are really the same. AMD will continue to gain server market share, possibly at an increasing rate. And I say that because TSMC will bring more 7nm capacity online throughout 2020. This leaked slide from ASUS shows us that Intel has something more coming in the second quarter, something being 48 cores with Cooper Lake. There was a rumour suggesting that this is a 3-die part, 2 core dies and an I/O die, plus finally for Intel, PCIe 4. That last rumour appears to be incorrect, according to this slide, which still shows PCIe Gen 3. Intel also said that Cooper Lake would max out at 56 cores, not 48 cores. So make of that what you will. It is 14nm still, and it's 300 watts for the 48 core part, which is about the absolute maximum you would expect to see in an OEM box. However, I did receive information that new systems were being worked on and water cooling will be required. As if this wasn't strange enough, only 1 quarter later, Intel are supposed to be launching Ice Lake, their first 10nm server part, which is on the same platform. As if that wasn't strange enough, Ice Lake only has 38 cores per socket, which is down 10 compared to Cooper Lake. The TDP, however, is only down by 10%. I think that this part is even stranger, as we're surely looking at a dual chip design, and Intel surely didn't deliberately create a chip with 19 cores, so this has to mean that this is very likely to be a salvage part. 1 year ago, Intel showed off the CPU during their architecture day, and it's clearly a large package. I think if you put all this together, then Ice Lake is likely to be the 3-chip part. So that would be 2 10nm core chiplets with possibly a 14nm I/O die. And this time, for sure, we'll be seeing PCIe 4. But why is Intel doing this? I would guess that at 270 watts, that is just about coolable on air. So perhaps this 38-core Ice Lake part is the very best that Intel can do under normal conditions. Remember though, the Ice Lake core did have a pretty nice IPC uplift of over 15% or so compared to the Skylake generation. So even if clock speeds are down on the 14nm parts, it could be a much more competitive part against Rome. Though it won't get anywhere near the 64-core 7742. And in fact, AMD now has an even faster part, this 280-watt EPYC 7H12, which has a 2.6 GHz base clock and is also designed for water cooling. The problem for Intel though is that Ice Lake, it won't be up against Rome, it'll be up against Milan. And from this high-performance computing conference held back in October, we learned that Milan would be a 64-core part, same as Rome. I found three parts of the presentation most interesting. First of all was that Milan appeared to be doing away with the CCX layout of having 4 cores, each with their own 16 megabytes of L3 cache. Now the chip appears to be a true octo-core with shared 32 plus megabyte of L3 cache. The second part of this presentation was when the speaker noted that Zen 2 was still bound by memory, saying that the Rome core is so efficient that they simply cannot get enough data to the core. This is actually a nice problem to have. Back in the days of Sandy Bridge and Bulldozer, Sandy Bridge gained a lot of performance with faster memory, while Bulldozer didn't. The reason for that was Sandy Bridge had a great core, whereas Bulldozer didn't. And then a month or so ago, AMD's Forrest Norrod dropped something of a bombshell on Intel with his comments regarding Milan's IPC, noting that Zen 3 will be based on a completely new architecture and will deliver performance gains right in line with what you would expect from an entirely new architecture, before stating, at a time when Intel is promising double-digit IPC gains for future microarchitectures, AMD is confident in being able to drive significant IPC gains each generation. As I noted in a recent video, Zen 3 Milan is already sampling, so it's not like Forrest is guessing. The fact here is, we have the obvious change to the architecture, which could enable a large IPC gain, the new cache layout, and we heard that Zen 2 was bound by memory. And recently we've seen that Ryzen 3000 makes some pretty decent gains with tighter memory timings as well. We shouldn't be surprised by 20% plus IPC increase with what is effectively this doubling of L3 cache, at least. Ice Lake gains 18% IPC, but maybe loses clock speeds because of 10 nanometers, while Milan will gain 20% plus IPC, and it will gain a little bit of clock speed too, in all probability. And then finally, it's going to be 64 cores versus 38 cores. Again, it is just no contest. And if anything, AMD could be even further ahead, if 20% IPC is lowballing it. The third interesting part of the presentation was the roadmap for all of this. During this video, at first I thought that these production areas didn't make a lot of sense. Naples launched in June 2017, and this production part here appears to be right at the end of the second quarter, which would have been June. Of course, the thing here is, Naples came after Ryzen 1000, which launched in March, but the Zen chips that both Ryzen and EPYC were based on must have been produced long before March. Now for Rome, production can just about make some kind of sense for June, as it was August before Rome launched. But what's really important here though is, if you compare to both Naples and Rome, which clearly state the end of the second quarter for production, Milan's production is pretty deep in the third quarter. If we extrapolate based on Rome, then Milan is starting to look like a pretty late part. So with that in mind, perhaps Intel could get a 2 or 3 month lead in terms of time to market with Ice Lake SP. They're gonna need all the help they can get though, as a few days ago Charlie over at Semi-Accurate claimed that their entire server roadmap was delayed again. Now, Intel refuted the claims, but they've been doing that for years. From this slide we can see that Ice Lake was due early in the second quarter of 2020. That is right at the left edge there. Later in this ASUS slide we can see that it's Q3. And as recently as a few days ago, Intel's Murthy Renduchintala stated at the Global TMT conference that Ice Lake server would be coming at the end of 2020. So as usual, there's gonna be some truth in this delay talk. Moving on to the segment which will likely be most relevant to us, and certainly to me, which is the desktop. Next up for Intel is Comet Lake, and a maximum of 10 cores. Very little is known apart from these leaked clock speeds, which look okay. And another recent leak showed the i5-10600, which is a 6-core hyper-threaded CPU. 3.3 GHz base clock isn't fantastic, however it does ramp up to 4.7 GHz with turbo, What's actually interesting about that though is, previously we caught wind of another leak by Momomo over at Twitter, which shows the same 3.3 GHz base, but this time a 4.8 GHz turbo. On paper, these i5s look like pretty decent competing parts for the Ryzen 5 series, depending on the price. But there was something else interesting here, as this Comet Lake SKU leak didn't include any i7s or i9s, which reminded me of some leaked information I received in early October, which told me Intel is having major issues with their internal power regulation. That is the kind of thing that is likely to affect the higher end parts more, so that's something to look out for if the i5s and i3s launch first. Even if the i7s and the i9s launch, it appears that Comet Lake is essentially Coffee Lake refresh with 2 more cores, which as we know was Coffee Lake with 2 more cores, which was KB Lake with 2 more cores, which was Skylake with a clock bump. 10 Skylake cores on 14nm is not all that interesting versus the 12 and 16 Zen 2 cores, and it all just seems rather pointless to me. Where things do get interesting is with what AMD does next. As I noted earlier, Zen 3 does appear to be coming late in 2020, if the roadmap is anything to go by. And this is for server, which should be getting prioritised by AMD. Zen 3 is being manufactured on TSMC's 7nm Plus node, which uses EUV and promises 10% more performance at the same power, or minus 15% power at the same performance as 7nm. Also important is the 20% reduction in area, which could allow for more cache, as suggested by this 32 plus MB L3 in the slide. Looking at this amazing die shot of Zen 2's core die, which is 10.32mm by 7.34mm, that's 75.75 square millimeters. The L3, these 8 blocks in the middle, should be around about 40% of the die, which would be around 30 square millimeters. So we could perhaps see 64 megabytes of L3 per chiplet, with all of that cache available to every core, remember. And while this would make it a slightly larger die than the Zen 2 chiplet, it would still come under 100 square millimeters, which is still a very small chip. What about yield on the new process though? We know that processes start off with lower yield. However, TSMC's N7 is still 7nm. It just uses EUV for some of the layers. According to TSMC, it has similar yield to 7nm. But how good or bad is that yield? Well, this is where it gets very interesting, as recently, Wikichip reported on TSMC's 5nm update, which included this amazing slide. As we can see, N7, the red line, has a defect density of only 0.09. And let me just run this through the wafer calc quickly to show you what that means. You remember, the Zen 2 chiplet is 10.32 by 7.34mm. And of course we need to use 300mm wafers. We now set the defect density to 0.09, hit return, and that gives us a 93.45% yield rate. That is fully working 8-core chiplets, remember, and an enormous 720 good dies on the wafer. And remember, AMD is struggling to supply their markets even with this yield rate, so either they have a very limited number of wafers, or something else is up. Where this story gets even more interesting is, this 0.09 defect rate is not the actual defect rate of AMD's process, and nor is it the defect rate in November. In fact, this 0.09 is the defect rate from July, before we even had Zen 2 on the shelves, and this is actually for the mobile process. How do I know that? Looking back at Wikichip in July, I found this slide. Looks familiar, right? It's exactly the same in fact, except without the defect rate. But all these points are exactly the same. And what's more, below it, we can see the N7 large die defect rate, which means with TSMC pushing into HPC, they have started reporting defect densities separately for mobile customers, that's the top one, and HPC customers with die sizes of 250 square millimeter dies and larger. I can't actually think of any reason why they'd specify large dies. However, we know that Navi 10 is 251 square millimeters, And for sure that counts as part of this large die defect rate, which is even lower than the mobile process. Zen 2 is also on the high performance node, so it must be included in this large die defect rate, which looks like it has to be around 0.6 or 0.7. In actual fact though, even at 0.6, it doesn't make a huge difference to the yield of Zen 2, as it was already pretty close to the maximum anyway, but every little counts. So the yield on 7nm plus for Zen 3 is likely to be north of 90%. So you might think that moving everything over to 7 plus ASAP is what makes sense. However, that will come down to factors like capacity and ramp time. Historically, EUV suffered from a lack of throughput, which is only around half of a non-EUV machine. However, EUV allows for a reduction in mask count, which should claw back some of that disadvantage by allowing for faster production cycles. I have no idea what percentage of TSMC's 7nm machines will be switched over to EUV in 2020, but I would guess at under 20%, and possibly even under 10%. The point here, if you recall we were discussing consumer grade CPUs, is I am just not certain that we will see Zen 3 on the desktop on 7nm plus in 2020. It's important to note that seeing two new architectures 1 year after the other is pretty rare these days. Bulldozer was refreshed with Piledriver the year after, Zen was refreshed with Zen Plus the year after. To go Zen 2 then Zen 3 back to back on the desktop, that really would be something. What AMD could do, and I've alluded to this before, is launch Zen 3 Milan in servers while refreshing Zen 2 on the current 7nm process. Or they could use this N7P optimization, which unlike N7+, the EUV node, uses the same design rules and is fully IP compatible with N7, so there would be no need for any reworking with Zen 2. It would simply port over to this new process, what is said to translate to either 7% performance improvement at the same power, or up to 10% lower power at the same speed. And that is of course compared to N7. And really that sounds a bit like what the move from 14nm to 12nm brought with Zen Plus. It was a handful percent. But in this case, the very best chiplets would now turn into Ryzen's, as the new server chips will be moving to the Zen 3 and the 7nm plus process. So AMD could actually get a double benefit from such a move. Essentially, all the current Zen 2 wafers get shifted to this N7P and, well, who knows what kind of clock speeds we'd see. But there should be some pretty decent gains in performance per watt. Another alternative is that they could backport Zen 3 from N7 Plus to either N7 or N7P. So that way, the IPC gains from Zen 3 will be achieved at the cost of slightly lower clock speeds and performance per watt. What AMD would gain out of that would be much more capacity on the current 7nm nodes. Will they do that? I would be very, very surprised, because that is in fact two different designs. And some of you may be wondering why I'm even suggesting this, as there's been no indication on any roadmap that AMD will do this. All indications point to AMD releasing Zen 3 and presumably Ryzen 4000 based on Zen 3 towards the end of the year. The whole point is simply, near the beginning of this video I gave figures on market share. At some point AMD needs to start fighting a market share battle on the desktop, and they're not going to do it by moving on to 7nm plus EUV next year. All that will happen is we will get the same situation regarding supply that we've seen this year. And the requirement for a real push in volume is even more obvious given Intel's dreadful supply issues. At the recent talk, Murthy again went over Intel's 14nm supply issues. And only last week we learned that they were resurrecting 22nm Haswells for the Pentium market. Well, this is a pretty desperate move. It will help to alleviate some of the pressure on Intel, as will their 10nm Ice Lake server products. Intel is so strained on 14nm capacity, they are trying everything to alleviate that. It's been over 2 years of shortages for Intel, and this shortage could continue until 2022. Someday AMD surely did the calculations and figured that there is a large swathe of desktop market just begging to be taken over. The motherboard guys, the OEMs, they are all sick of not getting supply from Intel. It's fairly telling that their CEO Bob Swan recently stated that holding 90% CPU market share, it is no longer the goal, and that Intel will instead focus on winning 30% of the silicon share. Holding 90% CPU share is simply no longer possible for them if AMD is anywhere near aggressive at going after it. So to end this video, and let's be honest, it's been pretty rosy for AMD and pretty awful for Intel, but that is the reality of today's CPU landscape, and most of what I have discussed I believe will transpire in 2020. The real reality is that Intel is still massively larger, selling many more parts and making much more money, and this will continue in 2020 and beyond. And even on the hardware side, it's not all a total disaster for Intel. In mobile, they have Ice Lake on 10nm, which looks like a good part, and according to Anantech's Surface Laptop Showdown, it runs circles around Zen Plus. Of course, we're expecting Zen 2 mobile chips soon, sadly still with Vega graphics though. I would not expect to see a big difference materialising in the laptop market share over 2020. Intel has their Athena project and throws a lot of money at the ecosystem. Whether or not they have enough 10nm supply to supply the market in the way they have been, that is unlikely. However, they'll get by with a combination of 10nm Ice Lake and 14nm parts at the high end. AMD, on the other hand, will have a lot of 7nm wafers next year. However, a lot of that will be going to the game consoles. Laptops are a fight they're really not fighting. And that's what makes sense. And I could have continued with this video, and I had planned to talk about 2021 and beyond. However, it's already ran on far too long, so I'm gonna call it here. 2020 is gonna be interesting for a variety of reasons. Clearly though, Zen 3 is the big one, and unless Intel has backported Ice Lake to 14nm, they could be in for a hell of a trouble in the desktop late next year. Or maybe early 2021. I'll be back with something different, I think, before the Christmas break. In the meantime, check out the website. Anubius has written some really nice technical pieces on the inner workings of CPU, which is well worth a read. And we're currently at part 4, with more parts to come. I'll catch you later, guys.